But this is the cycle we find ourselves in. First law of Trumpodynamics. Every action is met with a very not equal overreaction, thus throwing off our ability to know when shit is actually getting real. Like last week's pardons. Was it shitty? Yes. Should you have let some of those terrible people? No. Is it an abuse of pardon power? I don't know. But that is his constitutional power. Again, for some reason, we have given presidents the power of a king. And then we say, oh, by the way, with that power, you're not going to get all like kingly and shit on us, right? To put that in constitutional terms, if I could, don't hate the player, hate the founding fathers.
Well, I think we've got the episode title for this, Nick. Hey, everybody. Welcome into an all-new episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Zaveri.
On the program today, there's so much that you may have missed. The daily, it feels like weekly, flows of orders, acts, everything else coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Nick and I are going to break it all down, but this is a big show, Nick. So we couldn't do it alone. We needed to add some muscle to break down some of these actions, especially the ones that kind of cross over into the legal realm. So in just a bit, you're going to be hearing from former federal prosecutor. You've probably seen her legal analysis over on CNN, my buddy, Alyse Adamson. She's going to be joining us in just a hot second, as the kids say out there. Nick, before we say hello to Alyse and we welcome her into the program, an all-new episode of Journalistically Speaking with Rick Sanchez, the former Emmy and Peabody Award winner, is out there over on leonmedianetwork.com or listen to wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the show, Rick examines the new head of the State Department, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the special relationship they kind of had, given the upbringing and background, both Cubans, both down here in Miami. It sounds like the host of this show, Nick. That is true. But Rick dives deeper into what Marco Rubio will bring to the table different than former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and why he thinks Rubio will actually make a dent in foreign relations because of this talking to the other side. Who is the other side? Find out on your episode, Journalistically Speaking, over on leonmedianetwork.com or listen wherever you get your podcast. Nick, I before we bring Alyse out here, this has been a crazy week. And I was thinking about this yesterday as I was watching a segment that was airing on one of the networks. I forget which one, but there was kind of a back and forth about the immigration stuff. And it got me thinking, like, there is this tendency, and I'm looking at it again from the news producer lens, like there is this tendency to think like you're drinking out of a fire hydrant that, is just completely coming out, versus you got to pace yourself here, right? Like this is 8 days in. Are you feeling some of that in terms of the information? We're going to break all of this down in just a second with Alyse, but how are you feeling with everything that's happening right now? Is there a calm Nick Zaveri right here, or is there a fired up Nick Zaveri behind that?
I think at the moment is a resigned Nick Zaveri. I'll say this though, as a public service announcement to folks. Obviously, be sure to always stick with our program. We try to give a measured response. In 2025, I'm trying to do a better job of that, just myself. But what I'm seeing that 8 days in is not helping people is the glut of information. Some of it being hyperbolic. What you're seeing on social media, primarily social media, actually. And I'm reminded of how, this is why it pays to just follow journalists, to just read. I've been daily, I don't have, as Mike knows, during the week, I start grad school next week. I'm just trying to put in better practices to make sure I'm just staying focused and not going down, social media rabbit holes. So I just during the week don't pay attention to the stuff. So when I'm reading an article about, say, today, the Trump organization, that's funny, the Trump administration, putting a freeze on federal spending in the form of programs going out. Well, to read it from the Washington Post, one of the things you'll first see is that there is a stipulation that money is going directly to individual people will continue. Then that's a statement from, I believe it was from the new press secretary or someone in the administration said that. And now we'll see. compare that with what you're finding on X, Instagram, Facebook, all these places where people may not be reading the full story, but they run to social media to share what's concerning them. It also doesn't help when you're following just other television networks and just sort of taking in a lot of the editorializing and not so much the facts of it. So what keeps me sober throughout all this is just trying to read news sources, trying to just follow the reporting. In general, yes, I have serious concerns about all these things coming out, but my resolve is more measured because I'm just trying to find, and that's what I'm excited about, talking with Alyse about in the moment, is just let's just stick with the facts. What do we know is actually happening? I mean, the point I'm getting at is I think we have to be really, really measured right now. Not to mention, folks, a lot of the people who run these apps are the same people that were at the dais for the inauguration.
All right. Well, we alluded to her before. Speaking of chasing the facts, let's get the legal facts about some of this stuff, Nick. And as I mentioned before, she's a former federal prosecutor, friend of the show, Alyse Adamson. Alyse, good to see you again. Thank you for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back.
So, Alyse, you heard a little bit of what we were talking about there as you were in our pseudo dressing room there waiting us out here. But can I ask for you, as you've been interpreting this? I know you and I have talked about this a little bit, and you come at it from a different lens because you actually formerly worked within the Department of Justice. You have some friends that, in terms of the January 6th stuff, and you were telling me some of that stuff, but kind of at a high level for you over these last 8 to 9, 10 days, can you kind of put in perspective of what Nick and I were mentioning, that does it feel like we're drinking from a hose, or is that kind of self-inflicted? And some of these things, you got to take them in isolation and kind of break them down that way.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And of course, I'm just speaking from the perspective of someone who has some inside information about things that are occurring within the Department of Justice, right? Because I understand the main point, which is we need to be careful. We need to see ultimately where these things land. I think a lot of people are saying right now, a lot of this is shock and awe, but some of that I agree with, some of that I disagree with. I think there are a lot of things happening right now that are legitimately really bad. And there are a lot of these really bad things happening. So we saw the pardons of all of the January 6th defendants. We knew that was a possibility because Donald Trump had platformed on it. But what we also saw just a week later was 12 prosecutors being fired from the Department of Justice, 12 prosecutors that worked on the prosecution of Donald Trump, with the justification being these folks perhaps would have a problem being loyal to the department, which again, you're not loyal to the department, you're loyal to the Constitution and furthering the interests of justice. And then on top of that, there's also reporting, and I know to be true, that they've opened up an investigation into the prosecutors who investigated the January 6 cases themselves. So, we have all of that. Those are a few examples. And then that's in the overlay of all of the executive orders, all of the reporting we're hearing now. Now I've just read that they're offering buyouts of federal workers. So I do think we're drinking from a fire hose, and a lot is happening. And I think this is very distinguishable from Trump 1 in 2017. We have not seen the likes of this kind of systematic bureaucracy dismantling, I think, before, and hopefully we'll never see it again. But who knows at this point?
Alyse, to that point about what we're seeing in this unprecedented shift from Trump version 1. It seems like we're seeing also a response from some like federal judges across the country, and it seems almost like we may be playing a game of what I best could consider like inverted whack-a-mole. So rather than the White House trying to stamp this out, we're just seeing judges from different states coming forward and calling into question some of these executive orders. Given that we're seeing that play out now, what of these orders has the most likely chance of sticking versus those that we may see being played out in a court until it eventually gets on the docket of the Supreme Court?
When you say sticking, do you mean which ones of the executive orders are just going to proceed without any kind of injunction? I mean, I think that's a good question. And honestly, I don't know. And I don't know because everything has become so unpredictable. It used to be that legal analysts, we could sit here and say, well, it's most likely that X is going to occur because of, YZ. I think what we're seeing with these litigations and all of the new novel theories being advanced, that it is incredibly hard to predict. I can tell you on the flip side of the reverse side, I think we are definitely going to see the birthright citizenship question go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So that is one EO that I can say right now, I'm very confident is going to have a look from SCOTUS, and that's because birthright citizenship is a clause in the Constitution. It's coming from the 14th Amendment. There's a constitutional question there. On its face, this executive order is completely unconstitutional. So it needs to be before the Supreme Court. Some of these other orders, some of the crazy ones, I think it was, again, coming back to something I'm more familiar with, investigating people, various federal officials who looked into certain investigations. The fact that that's an executive order blows my mind, number one. Such an abuse of power, so obviously vindictive. But I don't know how that's going to play out in the court. So, I wish I could give a more satisfying answer, but we're in such unprecedented times, and so much of what we thought would happen did not happen, that it's just impossible to tell.
Sticking with birthright citizenship for a moment, because it's a term we're hearing often. This would be a good opportunity just to make clear for everyone as it relates to the 14th Amendment. What do we as citizens have access to as it relates to the concept of birthright citizenship?
We have access to being U.S. citizens. So then we have all of the rights afforded to us under the Constitution and the laws of the United States. That's protection. This is our home. And I think most relevant to why the president wants to end birthright citizenship, it gives us the rights to avail ourselves of the United States. Otherwise, we can be removed from the United States. Here as a citizen, if we break the law or do anything, we're going to be subject to the justice system, but we're still U.S. citizens. Once we serve our time, we go back to the United States. It is our right. However, if you are considered to be a foreign national, then you can be deported. You could be expelled from the United States. So it's all of the protections enshrined in the Constitution that are afforded to you as a citizen. If you are not a citizen, then you can be removed from the country, and you no longer get the benefit of all of those rights. And I just want to really consider what this means. I'm sure that your viewers, your listeners have a general idea, but essentially what President Trump has sought to do with this executive order is anybody born after February of this year to people, immigrants of various categories. It's not just two parents who are undocumented. It's certain categories of immigrants. I've seen some analysis saying even folks on F-1 visas, their children wouldn't automatically be granted U.S. citizenship. So that means even if they're in the country legally, they're not U.S. citizens, and they would have no rights to stay in the country after that legal status has changed. So you're born in the United States. This is the only country you've ever known. You've gone to school here, and then all of a sudden somebody is telling you to go back to a foreign country. And make no mistake, it's a foreign country because they were born within the United States. It defies the spirit of that clause in the 14th Amendment. It is, in my mind, antithetical to the founding of the United States of America. And I think it would be very dangerous precedent if the Supreme Court were to rule in the president's favor.
I feel like that's a phrase I've heard you say before on television, and other legal analysts, as they've given presidents, immunity between official and unofficial acts. I wanted to stay in the adjacent lane of, birthright citizenship, but also illegal immigration. I want to play for you something that came down earlier today from the White House press secretary, that she was asked a question about, obviously, the executive order around immigration. Take a listen to what you say. I want to ask a question after this. So take a listen to this.
President president has said countless times on the campaign trail, I've been with him at the rallies, I know you've been there covering them too, Peter, that he is focused on launching the largest mass deportation operation in American history of illegal criminals. And if you are an individual, a foreign national, who illegally enters the United States of America, you are, by definition, a criminal. And so therefore, you are subject to deportation.
I apologize for interrupting. So to be clear, it's not violent criminals do not receive precedence in terms of the deportations taking place.
The president has also said two things can be true at the same time. We want to deport illegal criminals, illegal immigrants from this country, but the president has said that, of course, the illegal criminal drug dealers, the rapists, the murderers, the individuals who have committed heinous acts on the interior of our country and who have terrorized law-abiding American citizens, absolutely, those should be the priority of ICE, but that doesn't mean that the other illegal criminals who entered our nation's borders are off the table.
The 3,500 arrests ICE has made so far since President Trump came back into office. Can you just tell us the numbers? How many have a criminal record versus those who are just in the country illegally?
All of them, because they illegally broke our nation's laws and therefore they are criminals as far as this administration goes.
All right, so Alyse, you heard a little bit there. We were all shaking our heads. Nick said a profanity that was edited out for time constraints. But I'm curious right now because I heard a CNN panel later in the evening between an advocate and CNN's Scott Jennings arguing a little bit about this basic premise, right? Which is this administration has a different policy than the other administration. Yeah, you may have been here for 30 years, contributing to society, no crimes committed. But the foundational part of it is that you came here illegally. So you should be sent back because you are illegal. Now, again, we think it's callous, right? I'm asking you from the legal perspective, somebody, let's say someone's listening to this show that has that exact scenario playing out for them. I live here in Miami, Florida. I can't tell you how many times I know of people that are in this area that work and contribute to different projects throughout the city that fall under that guise. So what would be your advice to them from a legal perspective in terms of what this administration is trying to carry out with respect to them entering this country once upon a time illegally?
I don't think they're safe. I mean, you've just heard the position of that the president's taking, that if you stepped foot in the United States, we say undocumented, he is calling them illegals, then you, by definition, are a criminal. And so, if the premise of your question, Mike, is, for the folks that, crossed into this country, we used to say without papers, right, 30 years ago, but have been law-abiding this entire time, contributing positively to the community, to the economy, raising families here. Based on what we just heard, there is no distinction between that individual and someone who has crossed, say, yesterday. And so for all of those folks who mistakenly believed that the position was, we just want to deport criminals, and in their mind, they're thinking criminality as narcotics dealers, violent felons, and that they somehow are safe because they have been living in the United States for decades and being upstanding, in their mind, citizens, but they're not. They're just as at risk as anybody else.
Damn shame we won't be applying this to European undocumented people. Alyse, to that end, and as it relates to immigration in general, does that feel like one of the areas where the president's EO has the most likelihood of remaining in place, or not even influencing, becoming policy with very little pushback, even if it was a more Democratic-friendly Congress?
Perhaps. I mean, again, you got to think about this. When you say policy, I mean, Congress can legislate on some of these issues. And of course, once something has become law, so long as it does not violate the Constitution, then we have a duly passed law, and that has a greater effect than executive orders, which of course are superseded by by laws passed by Congress or by constitutional provisions. So that's on the one hand, there's that. Now, of course, if the executive orders are unconstitutional, then there's going to be legal challenges. So if your question is, will they stand? Well, legally, can they stand? That's a question for the court. But in the court of public opinion, when you say, is there pushback? Well, we've seen over half the country supports a stronger stance on immigration. That is one of the reasons that the president was reelected, right? I mean, when I've just kind of anecdotally spoken to people, the two issues that came out the most were inflation, costs of goods too high, and immigration, which, they tied to problems, kind of pervasive problems in the United States. And so, I don't think you'll see as much societal pushback, but I do think that there are lots of groups out there. I know a lot of attorneys who are standing at the ready to challenge this in court, because I think that is the only real effective avenue to stop some of these orders, which is through legal challenges.
So Alyse, when you came on, you had mentioned, I think, in one of your responses about this freezing of federal aid, which just kind of broke a little bit before Nick and I started turning on the cameras here. And whenever people are listening to this, obviously this may be a day or two later. Can you kind of explain first what the judge that temporarily blocked part of this Trump administration's freeze on federal aid, because apparently it didn't impact some programs. At least the Trump administration is trying to walk that back and say it didn't impact programs like Medicaid and Social Security. But from what the U.S. District Judge here, Lauren L. Ali Khan, I believe, is saying, she said the government doesn't know the full scope of the programs that are going to be subject to the pause. Can you kind of explain a little bit of like, what is this? What is the judge getting at here in this temporary block? And it's until Monday, February 3rd, is my understanding from the recent articles that have been posted about this. But what, for people that take advantage of these programs that are listening to this, where do they see this netting out, or how will this impact them?
Yeah, well, Mike, I'm going to tell you that I'm not an expert in this area at all. But what I can say at a high level is that what's happened here, and I think this is what the judge is alluding to, is that we were very quick with the pen upon entering the office. And I don't think that the president or his team really appreciated what a lot of these pauses would do, how many programs depended on all of this funding, and what the practical impact of these orders would be. I can give you an example, and this is outside of a government agency, but there's also been pauses on grant funding to other organizations. And there is a group, I spoke to the head of this nonprofit organization. They have a wonderful mission. They go around the world keeping people safe by collecting old landmines. I mean, this is something nobody would really think about, right? But it poses a threat to folks in different countries. It throws as a security threat, but 60% of their funding comes from the US government. And so they were put on a pause. That's just a very small example of a program that was directly impacted, that nobody would even think would, a mission that would think would be disturbed by these pauses, but it's because they don't have an appreciation for how everything works. And so I think that's what the judge was alluding to there. And, again, I think this is also what happens when you start to issue all of these executive orders 7 days after taking office before really exploring what the impact would be. I go back to what I said before. A lot of this was meant as shock and awe. I think a lot of it was throwing red meat at the base to say, look, we're stopping all of this wasteful government spending. Look, we're stopping all of these government programs till we can rein things in, and we can and get all of this under control, without really thinking about what impact that would have on regular Americans. I saw, and I'm not as close to the facts on the student loan payments, but my understanding is that Pell Grants were going to be potentially impacted. And these are all collateral consequences that really could not have been well thought out, because a lot of them are non-controversial. And the average American's thinking, well, why wouldn't they get their money, right? There's really no rationale for keeping the money away from them. And so again, I keep falling back to my position, which is this is exactly why we need to initiate these challenges in court. This is exactly why we need to litigate these things, because courts will put these temporary injunctions in from or stays, depending on the cause of action, so they can get their ducks in a row.
Alyse, a moment ago, you were talking about just friends in your circle, in the legal field, legal colleagues that you know. In considering the current EO's potential moves by this administration, we've heard, as it related to immigration, even before Trump had won the presidency, the state of alarm and the readiness that many attorneys were going to have to fight challenges to immigration law. From what you're hearing, what is the next battle or battles that lawyers are preparing to take the administration on?
You mean in addition to immigration? Because
Yeah.
I think that alone is going to be quite the battle, and it's going to take the best and the brightest in the legal community a lot of time to litigate all of these issues. I think this is going to be a long-term fight. One of the other battles I think that lawyers are gearing up for is if the president was serious about investigating the investigators and prosecuting prosecutors who investigated the president, with respect to the January 6th insurrection, the Mar-a-Lago case, and then all of the prosecutors who were also involved with the January 6th investigations. I can't underscore enough the chilling effect that would have on the Department of Justice work, because all of the attorneys, most of the attorneys who investigated and tried these cases were all career staff. And that means these are attorneys who work for the Department of Justice. They don't change when the administration changes. They are not political. They are just there serving the interests of justice. And so if prosecutors are then subsequently brought up on charges for merely doing their job, and especially those who were told and assigned to these cases, I don't even think chilling effect is strong enough to describe the consequences of a reality like that. And so within my circle, and again, I'm in the District of Columbia, so this is very relevant to us. This is where a lot of those prosecutors practice. We are all prepared to take this up. And even if they aren't prosecuted, even the 12 that are fired, there is an administrative process within the government if you are terminated, to go and appeal. And folks are already saying this is wrongful termination. So I think, on a small level, that is one of the battles they want to take. That's a very narrow issue, but I think there are a lot of prominent attorneys that would take these cases on. But then one of the larger issues is also the federal workforce in general. Some of the things that they're being made to do, the 5-day-a-week mandate, the dismantling of DE&I programs, and now this most recent that just came out today, the federal buyout package. I mean, this is something you see in the private sector, the package, when you want people to go and they're offering it to hundreds of thousands of federal workers. And so I think that is going to be an area that attorneys are interested in. Labor attorneys, of course, but I think a lot of us who just see this going down a very bad path, setting very bad precedent. I mean, they're going to completely change the way the bureaucracy is structured. And I think most alarmingly, when we're talking about getting rid of career staff, I said to you, it's non-political. They're going to have to be replaced. And who are they going to be replaced with? I mean, I think we've seen Project 2025. That was something that I was very interested in. A lot of things other people have said, it's going to be Trump loyalists. It's going to be people who have a political agenda. And there are people like that in these agencies. They're called political appointees, and they serve at the pleasure of the president and they leave. They're not supposed to be stacking agencies with political appointees or people with a political ideology. They're just supposed to be career service employees. So that is very problematic. And I see that being another legal front that lawyers are gearing up to fight.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask you, because we started it asking you about the holistic view over the last couple of weeks, but you were alluding to something before about knowing some of the folks that are friends of yours that could potentially be on this investigated list. And I want to kind of circle back on that and tie it into the pardons that came out last week, because I know you lend some legal analysis out there about it. But if you could, for us, because there was a bunch of pardons that happened last week, including one of a convicted felon who, not even from the January 6th stuff, the Ross Albright stuff, and what he got pardoned with as well, which was something that the Libertarian Party, I know, was trying to get President Trump to kind of run on that and release him from prison. But can you kind of explain a little bit more to our audience about these pardons and the kind of precedent set? Because at the beginning of the show, we heard the Jon Stewart clip, you heard it play, and what he said, we kind of gave, unfortunately, presidents this king-like authority. And then when they act kingly, we're like, hey, can you not do that? So can you kind of break down a little bit of your perspective, the dangerous message does it send? Because President Biden, to be fair, and I don't want to equate apples to apples here, President Biden commutated or at least pardoned a bunch of sentences of some really dangerous folks that were on this list that were being criticized heavily by Democrats. So I'd love to get your take on just presidential pardons overall, but then what we saw recently with the Trump administration coming in.
Yeah, well, the pardon power is an expansive power. And that is just the reality. That's what Jon Stewart was talking about. I agree with him in some parts. I disagree with him in others, because, when the framers, the founding fathers, were conceiving of this pardon power, they were not imagining the scenario we're in right now. And that's because it's almost unimaginable. The entire reason the United States of America was formed was because they wanted to get away from tyranny. It was a rejection of the monarchy. And the way they set the system up, for the most part, was a system of checks and balances to prevent anyone to be truly kingly. I think what we have seen is just an expansion in general of the executive branch, of the office of the president, of how presidents view their role. The pardon originally, my understanding, and I'm not a scholar in this area, is that they were supposed to be, mercy granting and within the public welfare. And it was understood that with this power vested in this office, the chief executive would be exercising their discretion, much less like the Supreme Court is supposed to be exercising discretion. I mean, if you really think about the power that the Supreme Court has, we have now just seen with this Supreme Court what happens when, in my opinion, this is Alyse's opinion though, folks who have a certain ideology take intellectually dishonest positions so they can land at a certain result. And that's what we've been seeing with this Supreme Court. But before that, we had to give a lot of faith into the various branches of government. And in my mind, that the faith and the trust that we have put into that office has been reduced. It's been betrayed. It was an abuse of power. And I'm going to say it. I got attacked on Instagram for criticizing former President Biden, but I also think that he abused his pardon power. He also set a dangerous precedent, especially with his preemptive pardons. And I think because he did it before Trump, a lot of folks have said, well, President Biden knew that incoming President Trump was going to use his pardon power. So, and also be very vindictive. So President Biden had to do it as a measure of protection, but that ends justify the means kind of argument is a very slippery slope.
Well, I couldn't thank you enough, Alyse, for coming on the program and breaking all of this down, the legal perspective of all of this. I think there's a lot of people out there searching for information about this. It could be affected by either some of these programs that have been paused or the immigration stuff like we mentioned before. So can't thank you enough for hopping on the program, giving us a couple minutes here to kind of break this all down. Continued success to you. You always have a home here on Can We Please Talk. So thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.